Sean Diddy Combs isn't just fighting for his freedom, he's fighting to hold on to his fortune. Forbes now estimates his net worth is $400 million, a significant drop from the $740 million valuation just a few years ago. But that number could shrink even more. Federal prosecutors are moving to seize assets tied to the alleged criminal activity, and if convicted, Combs could lose everything from luxury properties to
the empire of Sean Diddy Combs once stood as one of the greatest examples of wealth, influence, and power in the entertainment industry. He was the mogul everyone pointed to when they wanted to prove that hip-hop was not just music, but a billion-dollar empire. He was the man on the Forbes list.
Considered a billionaire with a vodka line, a TV network, and a clothing brand, Sean Combs' fortune has taken a major hit. Forbes estimates his net worth is roughly $400 million, nearly half of what it was just a few years ago. Both his Beverly Hills and Miami mansions were raided in March of 2024 as part of the investigation into his alleged crimes. And that number may continue to drop as Combs faces a federal trial and a Justice Department forfeiture action that could cost him his empire. An empire that prosecutors allege was built, at least in part, through a pattern of criminal activity, including alleged sex trafficking, drug distribution, and violence, all used to advance what they call a racketeering enterprise. In the unsealed indictment, prosecutors outline how his business and personal assets allegedly played a role in carrying out or concealing the crimes. This means any assets connected to the behavior, even indirectly, could be seized, including real estate, companies, vehicles, and aircrafts. Now, his $60 million private jet has reportedly already been sold. The Beverly Hills estate is currently on the market for $61 million. And while Combs still owns his $48 million Miami mansion, a judge denied his request to use it as collateral for bond. In week 2 of testimony, Homeland Security Special Agent Gannon took the stand. Gannon, who helped lead the March raids of Combs' homes, walked jurors through photos of the items seized. Among them, parts of AR-15 style rifles with the serial number scratched off, loaded magazines, a Gucci bag reportedly filled with ketamine and MDMA, and personal items like lingerie and dozens of bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Prosecutors say this evidence is critical to establishing the elements required under federal racketeering laws, helping them show a pattern of alleged crime, criminal behavior used to sustain or conceal the enterprise. In an effort to protect what's left of his assets, Combs hired Stefan Casella, former deputy chief of the Justice Department's asset forfeiture and money laundering section, to fight the forfeiture action. If the jury finds Combs guilty, it will be up to them to determine how much of Combs' assets are subject to forfeiture. Anything forfeited after a conviction could be used to support alleged victims. Sean Combs denies all allegations. And to help us break down what's at stake, I'm joined by Jim Trusty. He's the former chief of the Department of Justice, Organized Crime and Gang Section. Jim, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure. Good to be here.
So, Jim, let's start with the forfeiture. This isn't just about prison time anymore. Prosecutors want his empire. From what you've seen in the filings, how aggressive is this?
Well, it looks to be very aggressive, and there's a couple of reasons I say that. The first is it's very broadly worded. What they're talking about is essentially any property, real or personal, that could constitute either facilitating property or instrumentalities, they call it, or proceeds. And so that's kind of the whole business empire of P. Diddy being at risk. And that's the second part, which is it's a RICO case, a criminal enterprise case, where they've defined the organization, the criminal enterprise, as not just Sean Combs, but as all these business interests that he has, including liquor labels, music labels, everything else you can think of. So they've set it up in a way where when they get to
the man on the covers of magazines, the one throwing parties in mansions that looked more like palaces, the one sipping champagne on yachts, and the one everyone wanted to be near. For decades, Diddy made the world believe that he was untouchable, that no scandal, no enemy, no rival could ever take him down. But today, that illusion has been shattered in a way so dramatic, so devastating, that the entire entertainment world is left stunned. Reports confirm that Diddy's once thriving empire has officially crumbled. His revenue streams have collapsed to zero, and he no longer has the financial firepower to fight the massive legal battles that threaten to consume what is left of his legacy. This is not a minor setback. This is not a dip in profits. This is not about a single failed business deal. This is about total collapse. For years, Diddy built his image around money. Every interview, every appearance, every Instagram post showed him draped in luxury, surrounded by wealth, living the life of someone who had it all. He positioned himself as the blueprint for success.
Things so broad?
I've seen it before. I mean, in the context of racketeering cases, you tell a much more complete story in a RICO case. You don't just focus on a particular moment in time or a crime. You tell the whole story of this criminal enterprise, which lends itself to big forfeiture moments. And so it's not totally unusual to see it this broadly worded. What I think is a little unusual is it's not very specific in terms of any preliminary seizures. It looks like they haven't actually seized anything yet, even though they executed search warrants and looked for evidence of things. And so a lot of times you'll see listings in there of bank accounts, automobiles, jets, whatever, that the government has already preliminarily seized to make sure it's still going to be available at the time they do a forfeiture hearing. So this one, it's a blank slate. And it's blank enough where if you're the defense attorney and you get to this next phase, which, by the way, is supposed to be with the same jury. They may not know that yet. But that second phase would be one where you really would say to the judge, I don't have any notice here, Your Honor. This is so broadly worded. I need to particularize it, have a chance to digest it, and perhaps bring in expert testimony on both sides about kind of legitimate sources of income versus illegitimate ones.
And you mentioned that, they're also linking his company. So maybe that's his, record studio, or maybe that's, his vodka line. But how does something like a vodka line, how can that potentially even be mixed up with this? How can they say that that's linked to an alleged crime?
Yeah, it's really one of two or maybe even three ways. One is if there's somehow a tie-in where that property, that business was used to facilitate the freak-offs that are in the indictment, for instance, or obstructionist behavior. So if they literally used a record studio for a party and the record studio belonged to one of his companies, you could say that actually facilitated or was an instrumentality to support the criminal conduct. The other way is essentially if it is a proceed, if it was essentially built on money that comes from illegal activity. And then thirdly, and this is where it gets really crazy confusing, so I'll keep it short, sometimes there's something called substitute assets where the government says, okay, we realize that particular asset, that car, that piece of art was not actually bought by proceeds or served to contribute to the crime. But because we can't find enough to satisfy the overall amount we're owed, we're going to take it as a substitute asset. It's a very government-friendly area, this whole idea of federal forfeiture. And again, I think they're in a position where they might have their mitts on almost anything he's ever touched.
And how do they decide just that number that they're looking for? Is there kind of like a flat out number that the government, when charging with these types of cases, that they say, hey, we're looking for 50 million, we're looking for 60 million? How do they decide how much?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, that is an easier task in some circumstances where you have a fraud situation where you can tell the amount of victimization and say, well, look, it adds up to 2.5 million, and they put that in the forfeiture indictment. They don't have that here. In a drug case, for instance, you might say, well, they were responsible for 10 kilograms of cocaine. A kilogram is about 30,000. So we're looking for 3 million, do the math. Here, it's much more wide open. I think you're looking at an actual trial within a trial if we get to the forfeiture phase, where there's going to be experts saying this is money that's untouched by any sort of criminal enterprise from the defense side, and maybe a forensic auditor from the FBI saying, here's why we're entitled to all these types of proceeds or instruments. So it is a wide open battlefield. It's going to be kind of a textbook example of how deep the government tries to reach for forfeiture if they get to that point.
At what point does that kind of strategy from prosecutors become legally risky for them, though?
The mogul who turned music into global power. But that image was smoke and mirrors, because the numbers today reveal a reality he cannot hide from. The money is gone, the empire is broken, the accounts are frozen, the brands have walked away. And the legal bills are stacking so high that not even a man once worth nearly $1 billion can keep up. To understand the magnitude of this collapse, you have to remember what Diddy once was. This was a man who, in the early 2000s, had his hands in everything: music, fashion, television, liquor, water brands, media companies. He was praised as a marketing genius, someone who could take a culture born in the streets and turn it into boardroom gold. Sean John, Bad Boy Records, Ciroc, Revolt, Aqua Hydrate, DeLeon, these weren't just names. They were empires within an empire. Each one was a money-printing machine, and together they made Diddy one of the richest men in hip-hop. But scandals change everything. And Diddy's scandals have not just been whispers. They have been earthquakes. Every revelation, every lawsuit, every explosive testimony chipped away at his brand until there was nothing left but dust. The financial collapse began when
You know, that's the thing. I mean, the court of public opinion every now and then turns on forfeiture. And, you know, the idea of forfeiture is that you don't want people to not just get away with crime, but profit from it. You know, being criminally prosecuted and put in prison doesn't mean that you've lost the assets. And so the idea is to kind of make things even, to hold people accountable, to not let them profit from criminal activity. But over time, you see abuses. You see situations where a person barely had a role in some sort of criminal conspiracy. I mean, literally was on the job for one day and is ordered to forfeit millions of dollars. And that bubbles up to the Supreme Court, where they say this is just not totally fair. So there are abuses of the forfeiture system that are seen from time to time. I think, look, if P. Diddy, if Sean Combs is convicted in this case, I don't think he's going to necessarily gin up a ton of sympathy. But there may be legal observers that say, hey, this is a broad, overreaching moment, you know, when they try to collect every single penny of a guy who obviously had legitimate income over long periods of his life.
And for those that do say, hey, isn't this just a financial overreach? How do prosecutors justify that?
Yeah, I think they justify it by saying, in this case, they'll say, look, two things. Number one, we didn't disable him financially pre-trial. We haven't actually locked into his accounts and taken things and frozen things where it might even affect his ability to hire attorneys or hire experts. And secondly, they say, look, it's a criminal enterprise that extended for a number of years, that where he had financial profit from this kind of power and control over an enterprise. So I don't expect them to be apologetic. I mean, they may, you know, end up showing moments of moderation where they say, well, we're not going to go after this company or that company, but they've left it all on the table for now, where they can do a very broad, you know, deeply reaching process if they want to.
And Sean Combs, he's already sold one jet. The Beverly Hills mansion of his is on the market for $61 million or so. Does that seem like someone who is confident that they'll walk, or could that work for or against him in court?
It's probably not going to be anything that's particularly admissible during the trial. It could come up during the forfeiture just to show that, you know, his overall stock has dropped. I mean, I think he's down to his last 400 million. It's a real tough spot to be in. But you know, but I think at the end of the day, you really can't draw any firm conclusions. He knows he's got a battle of his life going on right now. I mean, this is a life eligible racketeering case. Doesn't mean he'll necessarily get life. It's not a mandatory sentence. But, you know, if the facts are continue to be established of years of abusive and controlling behavior, it paints a pretty dark picture for him in terms of sentencing.
And Sean Combs, he's now brought in Mr. Casella, someone who literally wrote the book on asset forfeiture. What's Casella's role likely to be here?
Well, you know, I worked with Steph at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland for years. He is literally the expert on forfeiture. Whenever I have a situation in private practice where I have a question mark about forfeiture, that poor guy has to take my phone call. So he's a great pick. He knows what he's doing. He knows both the process and the law, which can be a little bit different sometimes. I think he's probably, you know, getting them prepared for the types of challenges. And by the way, I don't know this from him, but I would guess that he's basically figuring out what are the types of challenges we could raise in a forfeiture phase. What are the deficiencies in the government's approach? In other words, are they not discounting lawful employment? by Sean Combs. And frankly, some of it could even relate to like how he's spending money right now. When you have a broad forfeiture allegation, it's kind of hard to figure out, are they saying that I can't get attorneys of my choosing because I'm using proceeds of criminal activities? So I think he's probably giving a lot of
very started to back away. First came whispers of lawsuits tied to his liquor empire. Then came leaked documents and reports of discrimination and misconduct. Suddenly, the jewel of his financial empire, Cerroc and De Leon, was the Tosif under fire. The same deals that once put millions in his pocket were now draining him with legal fees. Then came Revolt TV, the media platform he once bragged would be the future of culture. Investors pulled back. Advertisers distanced themselves, and eventually, Revolt had no choice but to distance itself from him. Even the music, his original foundation, has stopped generating money at the level it once did. Streaming numbers are down. Radio airplay has slowed. New generations of fans are no longer streaming his classics the way they used to. And without fresh hits, the money dried up. The same industry he once dominated has now moved on without him. But the collapse of business deals was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, legal fees were draining millions every single month. Lawyers don't work for free, especially
someone who's been assaulted in the ways that were described. Most people have an idea as to how they will respond and act towards that, or their expectation if it happened to their loved one, how they'd expect their loved one to act. And in those situations, you don't expect someone to be tweeting. You don't expect somebody to be sending texts telling their abuser that they love them or that they want more of what took place. However, there are other people who see it from maybe more so the lens of a victim or someone who's been abused, who would say, you know what, that's not so beyond the pale of reason, because the abuse has been so entrenched in this person's mind that they then fall in love with their abuser. And so that's not something that they would, look askance upon or look down upon. So, one of the things about being in trial that I always remind my clients, is that despite all the rules that the judge gives people, no one leaves their life experience or their opinions at the courthouse door. It all makes its way into the courtroom and ultimately into the jury room. And that's why you can see such people who are on one side, like celebrating Diddy being acquitted on the much more serious charges, and other people who are like, how did this happen? I am upset. I feel like victims did not get justice today.
Right, exactly. And emotions did run really high, especially when the verdict came down, because I think I myself was pretty surprised at some of the jury's decisions in relation to some of the charges where they found him not guilty. But, obviously they made their decision. They listened to the evidence. They saw all the exhibits, and they made the decision that they did. And say come sentencing that Sean Combs is sentenced to maybe a couple years behind bars in prison. But do you think even after this trial, after everything that we've learned, after the many civil lawsuits that were also filed, do you think that there's any type of way that Sean Combs can have a comeback at this point?
Well, I think there's certainly a comeback that could be crafted and created in which we as the public may see. Listen, this is a person who has lived his life in the public light, in the limelight for decades. Okay. And so, as has been said before, fame is one of the more addictive or most addictive drugs known to man. And so he was a very famous, and now some might say infamous person. The idea that he allows the narrative to end with the way in which the evidence came in and this kind of mixed bag verdict does not is not what's the word I'm looking for? If I don't see Diddy allowing the last chapter of his book to be written with this trial, instead, the person that he's held himself out to be and who we now understand him to be is someone who is going to say, look, this was a dark chapter in my life, but now I'm going to show you the phoenix rising from the ashes. And there are other chapters. And I think that he will make an even more concerted effort to be more philanthropic, to be more of a victim's advocate. And also, once he completes these programs, he could say, look, I was once an abuser, abuser of women, abuser of drugs, abuser of fame, abuser of power and fortune, but look who I am now. And so I think that's a pretty powerful story. And frankly, people love comeback stories.
Yeah, they do love a good comeback story, but I'm curious, in your opinion, do you think that this is all just for maybe a showmanship, or do you think it's all for PR so that way, Diddy can walk out of MDC Brooklyn or possibly a potential prison and just be like, you know what, I am a changed person. But also in that same breath, what kind of message do you think that sends to victims out?
Actually, not when you're facing the kind of allegations that Diddy is. Each court date, each filing, each investigation means more money out and nothing coming in. Once upon a time, he could handle it. He had endless revenue streams. But now, with those streams cut off, the bills are piling faster than ever. Insiders say his accounts have been frozen, his assets are under scrutiny, and creditors are circling like sharks waiting for blood in the water. The most shocking part of this collapse is how quickly it happened. Just a few years ago, Diddy was celebrated as hip-hop's first billionaire mogul. He was neck and neck with Jay-Z for the top spot, and many believed his liquor empire alone would push him past the billion-dollar mark. He was still throwing million-dollar parties, still flying private, still buying mansions. But now, almost overnight, the numbers show zero revenue. Not reduced revenue, not slowed down profits. Zero. A complete financial wipeout. The man who once bragged that he wouldn't stop, has been stopped cold by scandal and court cases.
Guidance on how they walk through this process of dealing with a very broad, very deep, potentially deep-reaching forfeiture.
Since he is so knowledgeable, and since, I don't know if there's anyone who's more knowledgeable than him in this specific department, do you think that bringing him in may challenge the government's playbook at all?
I think it would certainly give them a moment of pause. Look, the reality is there's probably not a ton of time being spent worrying about forfeiture quite yet. They're probably figuring we'll get there when we get there. We got to try to get a conviction. But yeah, it's a shot across the bow. You see Steph Casella lining up on the other side, and you can say this about a lot of different type of expert witnesses and things where you say, wow, that's the king of DNA or the queen of forensic fingerprint recovery. So, I think it's a shot across the bow. They'll realize that they've got somebody that really knows their stuff on the other side, but that doesn't necessarily mean they change their approach in any way at this point.
And there's this idea of facilitating property, that a business or maybe an item helped enable a crime. How direct does that link need to be?
Yeah, we should ask Steph. But yeah, that's a great question. You have to be able to show, a significant link. It can't be just like this 6 steps removed kind of thing. Like there was a bottle of liquor that happened to be on the bar during one of these assaults, and he owns a liquor company, so therefore, the liquor we can presume facilitated the crime. You're going to have some, quantum of proof that's deeper than that. But it's very fact specific, and again, that's why I think you're probably looking. Even though a lot of times forfeiture becomes a very small afterthought to a criminal trial, this one really has the potential to be a completely independent kind of mini trial, delving into his finances, delving into issues just like that. Like how well connected can the government make these instrumentalities, these facilitating pieces of property? I think it's, inherently pretty difficult. But again, if you use a location, that's a little bit easier. If you say I'm going to use my liquor company headquarters, or I'm going to use a record business studio to have one of these freak offs, that becomes a much tougher climb for the defense to get out of it as an instrumentality. It's these kind of third time removed ones where they might have some success.
And like how you said, we're not just talking about past behavior here. Prosecutors say that this was ongoing. Does that make asset recovery just a little bit easier for them?
Yeah, in general, I'd say yes. Because you're talking about a period of years, and you're going to have, during these trials, you're going to have very specific stories from witnesses that say, I was there when X happened at this particular location. But you're probably going to get broad characterizations too. Like he would always, use his liquor to get people drunk before these freak offs. Or there were times where we met and discussed how we were going to do this at Office X or Home Y, or how planes were used. It might not be a specific moment, but he might have somebody that says, I was at the airport when his private plane brought prostitutes here. So you might not have the precision that you'd have with kind of a single event trial, but you're probably going to have pretty significant stories that, again, tie these properties into the possibility of being forfeited.
How much of a role does public perception play here? I mean, have we seen the DOJ make strategic decisions based on headlines?
Well, overall, sure. We could probably point to all sorts of cases that you could, I think, fairly characterize as a little bit of trophy hunting, where the Department of Justice or even non-federal prosecutors, think this is my great case, and they like the headlines that come with it. But look, I don't think this is an example of a case that's being brought in bad faith. I think it's unusual.
Mogul, and the truth of turned at this point in time. But I do find it interesting that she just, again, allegedly Lady Gaga went to them and said, either you drop him or I'm leaving now, right? So we had all the lawsuits going on. We had the raids going on. We had the Cassandra Ventura video happen. We had the apology video happen. The fact that this is happening now, what does that tell you? Again, assuming this allegation is true that she went to them and they decided to drop him.
It could be coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence. I've been saying, the Southern District of New York is a very serious district. My belief is he's going to be indicted before the end of the summer. I've been saying that since the first day of the raid. I think they're just dotting their I's and crossing their T's. And it could be, listen, we could be looking at like maybe Lady Gaga or someone she knows was subpoenaed to be in front of a grand jury. I don't know, and it could be that she started to feel uncomfortable knowing that this thing is moving forward. Who knows? But certainly I know that Lady Gaga is a individual that looks out for her image very closely. I think that she hires individuals that are the type of individuals that keep their cards close to their chest. She's not out there doing crazy stuff. You don't see pictures of her doing crazy things. I ran across her once at a hotel in New York. She was at the bar at a hotel in New York. She had very, very low key security, not big, gigantic guys that are pushing people out of the way. And in fact, when someone was taking a picture of her at the bar, one of her like low key security guys walked over and said, hey, listen, if you guys delete that photo, we can treat you to the next round. It's really not appropriate, and was totally cool about it. And I think that's the type of individual. I was impressed because a lot of my clients hire those big guys that are like, very aggressive, and she's very low key. So it doesn't surprise me that she would pull this move if she actually did. Because I don't think she wants to be associated in any way, shape, or manner with something that may ding her image or ding, the type of reputation she has. And there could be more to it. Like I said, yeah. I don't know if she's dealt with him in the past and they wanted to talk to her about something. That who knows?
But this is a big loss, right? Do you know anything about Alan Grubman? Or his firm or his reputation? I mean, the guy's he's pretty much a legend. Yeah, he's a legend if you're a lawyer that deals with entertainers, and I've been doing this for 27 years, and you don't know who he is, I'd be surprised, because he's represented not only living artists for a long time, he's represented estates of artists in selling the estate of David Bowie, I believe, right?
Correct. So he's a well-known guy. And he's got an impeccable reputation. So you'd be hard pressed to find someone who's in this field and deals with entertainers that wouldn't know who he is.
Does that make it difficult for another big powered firm to take up Diddy as a client, even on the civil front, after Grubman's firm dropped him or allegedly dropped him?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I think he'll find new representation. I don't think it's impossible. Certainly, there's always lawyers that are willing to take someone that's willing to pay them. So, whether or not it's going to